Sorry. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then perhaps the committee members could ask questions for 10 or 15 minutes of the panel on the intersection of patents, CCI, and data exclusivity, and how we should think about these issues going forward. So then I think it's fair to say that you were suggesting pretty strongly that you thought a voluntary approach that was unlike that of the EMA would be preferable for at least three reasons. First, because the voluntary approach would presumably have confidentiality for the information put in, there wouldn't be as much of an issue with respect to patents. Second, the voluntary approach would would involve the company or research sponsor itself determining what constitutes CCI, and I took you to mean that might be better than a centralized regulatory body determining what constitutes CCI as the EMA did. And third, and this is not something you explicitly mentioned, but it relates to what Trevor said, that it would be easier to maintain data exclusivity in those contexts. A, is that an accurate summary of how you frame the puzzle? And B, what would be the best argument against you in terms of a voluntary approach? Why, if you were going to play devil's advocate, why would a voluntary approach be insufficient, and what would be the best argument in favor of the EMA approach?
The truth matters, I actually, and so this could be just I wasn't communicating, I didn't formulate my thoughts sufficiently clearly. I wasn't actually thinking about it in terms of lines of voluntary versus not. The truth, my instinct is that voluntary might not cut it because company might not want to disclose certain data we really want them to disclose, and I don't know if that's right or not, but and I don't know how forceful the setup of default rules needs to be, because maybe there should be exceptions, something like that. But my instinct is that there should be pressure to do it. The sense is different. Is it's possible that if we have a lot more sort of gates in between the data and the public, those gates can allow us to preserve certain legal rights that are now premised around the idea of this stuff not being public, being patents and data exclusivity and stuff like that. And I mean, maybe it's not possible, but my instinct is that it can be either mandatory or we can try to be pushing companies to disclose this stuff, but there could still be those gates in between, and that those will safeguard the rights. But you know, I can certainly see a bunch of costs associated with trying to force companies to do it, including that, you know, if they don't want to do it, they're going to put up a fight, which means it might not happen. And then the other is I mean, it's going to run into a whole bunch of legal problems about takings and things like that, and so I don't know. And it's not clear to me that there's a huge zone of information that that really should be disclosed that companies aren't willing to disclose. It's possible that I don't know how big of a zone that is, but it's possible it's not that big.
So, Trevor, since you obviously have recently immigrated to the U.S. and spent most of your time over on the other side of the pond, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of the EMA approach, and some of the ways they've tried to put up some of the gates that Ben referred to? They've probably not put up as many gates as some might desire, but they've tried to put up some restrictions on the types of uses to which data can be put.
Well, I showed one attempt they made to put up a gate against the use to which data can be put, but that's a gate which is open to them to manage within their internal EU structure. It takes no regard of what other regulatory authorities and what competitors might do with that data. So unless there are some sort of international norms accepted about what can be done with that data, if the EU is determined, and if it succeeds in promulgating this policy, then it can qualify in any way it wants or anyway it suggests, the use to which people put that data, it would, I mean, the EU's exhortations in and of themselves do not necessarily constitute any sort of enforceable obligation in any other jurisdiction. And it strikes me that there is a real risk that some companies are going to look very much askance at starting to file early in the EU. If that situation continues, they will be thinking very much, what is going to happen to my data? This is all going to go out there in a quite uncontrolled way. I think unless the EU either voluntarily, within the context of the negotiation, within the context of the consultation which is ongoing at the present, and has been pushed back a couple of months now because they've had so many responses to the June consultation, or as a result of the ongoing litigation, actually ratchets back on the present approach, which seems not to accept that commercially confidential information has any validity whatsoever as a basis for stopping disclosure, does not seem to give any consideration to matters such as redaction or anything like that, which some companies have suggested. At present, the EMA do not seem to, in their public pronouncements, to be interested in that.
Just a quick follow-up question. So Ben has already told us that CCI and trade secrecy as categories are notoriously malleable, but you seem to be suggesting that what the EMA deems CCI is narrower than any reasonable categorization of CCI?
Well, it's... No, they interpret CCI quite widely, and they say, I mean, it is a wonderful passage in this paper. The agency respects and will not divulge commercially confidential data or information. Good. In general, however, clinical trial data cannot be considered commercially confidential information. The interests of public health outweigh the interests of public health, expressed broadly, lacking any specificity as to which interests, outweigh considerations of commercial confidential information. And that is, you know, wrapping up the conclusion in the reasoning.
Okay. Bernie, you have a question? Others, I think I see Joanne as well. So maybe Joanne first, and then Bernie.
I'm going to ask a question, and I don't have the legalese that you guys do, so I just want to be clear and make sure that I understand, based on what we heard before about certain countries that don't have data exclusivity, and the only one I remember is China. So if I could just be very, use a really specific example. So are you saying, Trevor, that if a company gets a product approved in Europe, from that date they have a certain number of years, so they have exclusivity, nobody else can launch that product except for that company that's marketing it? But are you saying then that as soon as the European Health Authority, let's say, releases the clinical study report publicly, are you saying that in China a generic company can just take that clinical study report and submit it to get marketing authorization in China, and therefore the innovator company has nothing, no reason really to seek approval in China or do specific studies in China to get the product approved there, because they're just going to have generic competition immediately? I just want to be sure I understand.
China does have a degree of data exclusivity. The problem is that data exclusivity, what is understood by data exclusivity and the sort of protection that one secures as a result of it, and how confidential the underlying data, how undisclosed the underlying data must be to found the data exclusivity, is not widely accepted. So it is conceivable, perfectly conceivable, that in another country such as China, indeed, potentially operating perfectly within the legal framework of data exclusivity in that other country, a complete disclosure, a widespread disclosure of clinical trial data, which was not in any way controlled or limited, or was not in any way subject to any sort of restrictions, would compromise the scope for data exclusivity in another jurisdiction like China, yes.
A mechanical explanation for this, because I find it kind of sort of interesting. So the way data exclusivity works is it says during the course of data exclusivity, no company other than the brand name company, the innovator that submitted the data, is allowed to rely on that data submitted by the innovator to get approval for the market. So, data exclusivity. So if you go to Europe, you pick up the packet of information necessary to get approval for a drug. You fly to China, you fly wherever, with that packet of information. You scratch off the innovator's name at the top of it, you put your own name, and you submit an application for a new drug, and you submit all the necessary information. You're not infringing their data exclusivity provisions, because the data exclusivity provisions only say you're not allowed to rely on their information that they submitted. So you've got your own, essentially. I mean, that's legally that's sort of what's going on in this space. And so to the extent to which someone can pick up that packet from Europe and just fly over and submit as their own, it's a way around the data exclusivity provisions. And if the patent system isn't going to stop it because there are gaps in the patent system there, or just in general, then you have that's the problem.
Bernie?
Joanne, as a non-lawyer, I'm trying to understand this a little bit. So given the problems that Trevor Cook described with undermining the incentives to invest to develop and take to market new drugs, what are potential remedies? And just right off the top of my naive head, I'm thinking of redaction. Is there some way of removing the set of data that are really going to cause disadvantage to the person who procured the data at considerable investment? And how elastic is that, and would redaction compromise the usefulness of the data for legitimate public health research purposes? Second is there some way of writing a data use agreement so that if I get data from one of these data sharing arrangements, I'm prohibited from doing the sorts of things that Ben just described? Or is the concern really much more subtle and internal, that by peering through this, I can find a way to get my novel products for the same disease to market quicker because I picked up something about the way they designed the trial, or they chose their endpoints, something like that. So I'm trying to think of, are there feasible ways to address the concerns that Trevor described that would still allow that data to be shared and used by researchers who are really not interested in trying to mine it for commercial purposes, but to really answer research questions that really do pertain to the benefits and risks of a product?
Well, yes, I think the first 2 points you've put, redaction, data use agreements, are approaches which are actually being suggested by various companies in the pharmaceutical sector. I think Sanofi's principles embrace that, and I think there will be other companies who do as well. Redaction is certainly something which was proposed by the parties to the current litigation in Europe, which involves the EMA. But that is not, for whatever reason, something which the EMA seem to be interested in participating in. Perhaps in the ongoing litigation, they will have to engage with that rather more than they have in the past. Data use agreements, Yes, and as I say, certain pharmaceutical companies are suggesting the use of those. They would have to involve the participation of the sponsor. Clearly, there would have to be some sort of approach to how one vets, perhaps an independent panel of some sort, which can determine whether it is a good faith application for the data. And the final point you make about getting an insight, not so much into the data itself, but into the regulatory strategy and the regulatory approach which worked on that occasion, so that you can try and replicate that for your own product. I'm sure that takes place. I'm sure that takes place. But if one is sharing the deep data under a data use agreement with authenticated researchers, then one should be able to guard against that.
Can I jump in on the data use?
Absolutely. George?
If I could just follow up. And the issue of redaction, sort of what do you redact and who defines commercial, again, I don't know the exact term, but information that could provide commercial advantage. Would a company want to redact so much data to protect its own investment in the new product that the data would be, the usefulness of the data for other research would be substantially undermined? Or is that so fact dependent and situation dependent that we just have to wait and see?
Well, I've spoken too much anyway, but my impression is that it is highly fact dependent, but it is also an approach which has, in the past, seemed to operate without too much difficulty. I just have the impression now that the EMA is just not engaging with that at all.
Hi, Bernard. This is George Contreras. I just wanted to jump in briefly on the question on data use agreements. I come to this world from a slightly different perspective, and you know, there's a lot of experience with data use agreements and public data. For about a decade and a half, they've been used to limit use of genomic type data that's been made publicly available since the HapMap project and all of the large-scale genomics projects after that. And, you know, they include lots of robust terms on limitations of use, academic research only, no reverse identification of human subjects. There are even anti-patenting clauses in some of these agreements. And those are useful, but they have proven to be of some limited use, especially in the international scenario, right? You have to have a way to enforce them. The agreements generally aren't going to be enforceable globally, and you also have to find a way to identify breaches of those agreements. So, you know, the private party contracting it has its limits, even among sophisticated parties in the U.S. and Europe.
Ida?
Again, not being a lawyer. On the notion of CCI, that it's information that should not be disclosed if it could lead to unfair commercial use. I'm curious about, you know, how unfair is construed. So I could see in a situation where there is no data disclosure that disclosure on a one-off basis might lead to, you know, unequal access and you know, loss of competitive advantage, and can then be unfair in that situation. But if there were a regime where all data was to be disclosed and there were clear rules and it was, so to speak, a level playing field, then it's fair competition. And I guess the way I'm looking at it, like Bernie's suggestion that, you know, if you go look at the data and you can find out a quicker way to do things, well, isn't that what we want for science? You know, and of course this comes from the whole open source movement in computer science. You know, we have open source and we learn and we benefit from each other, and it's fair competition, and in fact, you know, the best company wins. And so the statute maybe the law can be written the same way, but it's just recasting what's fair and unfair because we've changed the whole incentive structure and we've changed the playing field.
Hi, my name is Aliza Glasner. I work at the O'Neill Institute at Georgetown. And we've spent a lot of time looking at this issue of what is commercial confidential information, but also what is fairness and who are we trying to be fair to. So if your main objective is to be fair to the company or the academic or whoever's worked with the data, that's one thing. But if your goal is to be fair to the public health, that's a whole other question. And so how do you balance those two interests? And certainly looking at the clinical data that comes into the FDA as part of a drug submission, when you look at the history of court cases and how that information has been analyzed, the courts go both ways, leaning towards fairness. Are you going to balance the public health, or are you going to balance the commercial interests of the company? So I think that's an important cultural consideration for this company. I mean, our research, very much like what Ben said, has indicated to us that the idea of commercial confidential information or trade secrets is a very elusive term, and depending on who's interpreting it, can be interpreted in any number of ways. So if the goal is to share clinical information for the purposes of the public health, then I think this notion of fairness needs to, maybe fairness isn't really the right word. And I think also one tension we're looking at is there are ways for companies to protect their information. There are patent laws, there are data exclusivity periods. So how much protection and how much fairness do you want to assign to companies and to academics who have come up with the data in the first place, and how much are we trying to balance the needs of the public health and keeping things open and transparent?
So I kind of want to give you an economic answer, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this clearly. I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying, but I think there's a limit to it. And so the way I sort of interpreted the question was, well, look, if obviously when you hold all the information, if you were the only one to release it, then you would be at a competitive disadvantage. But if all of your competitors are releasing it too, doesn't that still put you on equal footing, and there's no real competitive disadvantage? So this is, again, from an economic perspective, I think there's some truth to that, but there's this countervailing concern, and you could see it in the context of just generic drugs. So you can imagine a world where we say, look, there's no patent protection for drugs over any at all. Everyone's in the same footing. You know, you develop a drug, that's great. Competitors can come on the market, they can make it, that's great. Everyone's in the same footing. What we're worried about in that setting, and this would be a setting where there's no lead time advantage you go on the market. What we're worried about in that setting is that companies actually need some sort of lead time advantage to make up their investment in developing the drug in the first place. Even though it's all fair, like everybody is in the same position, that with respect to certain types of investments that require significant capital outlay, whatever it is, that unless they have some protection over it, they won't make it in the first place. And so the trick is trying to figure out where that's true. Where is it the case that if we don't give somebody some protection over that, they won't create it in the first place? And so for me, it's like, and so this is the core of my area of study, which is intellectual property. And we kind of agree, okay, that's true with drugs in general, for new drugs. Is it true for a clever regulatory strategy to get through the FDA? The companies are kind of saying, yeah, kind of, but I don't know if they're right or not, whatever. But it's not, I don't think you can just sort of say, well, that can't be true, because if everyone's on the same footing as long as you make it open.
Yeah, those are the same arguments we'd have for protecting the intellectual investment of academics.
Right.
You know, again, there needs to be sort of a little protected time, but it might be helpful to think about, you know, all the different threats and all the different benefits, and not sort of set aside, you know, CCI as a specific kind, because I don't think it necessarily is.